Australia has used so many official meetings, negotiations, whether it's UN or other kind of multilateral or bilateral forums, to greenwash its fossil fuel expansion. And it's really nice to think that hosting a big expo is going to be the thing that gets us to change our ways. But I'm just not sure that it's compelling enough for that to happen. And the fact that the government has said, co-hosting this event will be a chance to repair our reputation, to me says they're already thinking about the optics, not actually what needs to be done.
One for Mum, one for Dad, one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to be talking about the United Nations and climate change.
Australia will be placing a bid to host COP31 in 2026.
With Australia to launch a bid to host COP31 with Pacific nations.
To help elevate the case for the region and need for more climate action.
This is an opportunity, will be an opportunity if we win the bid, to show Australia's capacity to help the world as a renewable energy powerhouse.
The island nations' support for our bid for a conference of the parties on climate change to be held with Australia and the Pacific.
The Business Council of Australia has come out in support of the government's bid to host COP31.
94% of Australians now acknowledge that the world is experiencing a climate crisis in some way.
Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast.
The storms are bigger, the surges are bigger, our reefs are disappearing, the fish are not there, people cannot survive.
Excessive heat warnings in place for much of Texas.
The window of opportunity for a safer climate in the second half of this century is closing rapidly, but it's not yet closed.
Is the world doing enough? You attended the climate talks. Are we doing enough as a
Not yet.
As
no.
a human race?
The UN Conference of the Parties is known as the COP. The COP is the supreme decision-making body of the convention. That is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, attended by all the countries who are signatories. In 2015, Paris hosted the COP. In 2021, Glasgow hosted the COP. And now the Australian government has placed a bid to host COP31 alongside a Pacific Island nation in 2026. But who gets to host a COP? And is it really a good idea for Australia to host one? Today, I'm talking to Polly Hemming, Director at the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program, to discuss the potential risks and rewards of Australia hosting a COP in partnership with the Pacific. G'day, Polly.
G'day, Ab.
So, first of all, I know I've just given a potted explanation there at the beginning, but what is a COP?
It's an annual conference, and as you said, the COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and it's been going for about 30 years. And what happens is every year, the nations that have signed up to the United Nations framework on the Convention of Climate Change, always trip over that one, they all get together and basically they work out negotiate essentially how best to tackle climate change and also support the countries that are most affected by climate change. And it sort of circulates in terms of who hosts it. So there's sort of UN groups, and within those groups, different countries host it each year.
So Australia is bidding to host a COP. How did this come about?
This was a commitment that Labor came to the 2022 election with.
Together we can end the climate wars.
And they said, if elected, we commit to bid to host a Conference of the Parties, a UN climate conference. And it was part of a suite of a whole lot of commitments that would show, if elected, that Australia was back on the international stage.
We're taking climate change seriously. Yep.
This is an opportunity, of course, for Australia to remind the world that we're back. We're back at the international table.
Under past governments, Australia has neglected its responsibility to act on climate.
Really importantly, they said, this is something that we are going to do in partnership with Pacific nations. We'll go and host this event, co-host it with Pacific nations. And in theory, that idea was welcomed by Pacific nations, but at the same time, it was highly qualified. And for those who saw our webinar recently, we had the Tuvalu Foreign Minister, Seve Panyu, and he said, we've always said we would support hosting this event with Australia if Australia took our conditions seriously. That is, if Australia took climate change seriously and supported what the Pacific wants, and that's phasing out fossil fuels and also having adequate support to deal with the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, so those are some pretty important caveats. So just before we kind of get into some of the details there, what essentially would be involved in hosting a COP? Why would Australia want to host one?
It's a really good question. So there's sort of logistical aspects about what would be involved, of course. Like it's like putting on an expo or any big conference that you've got to work out all that.
There's a blast from the past. Really
I still have the 1988 coin.
I think I've got that too.
Yeah, so there's all the logistical aspects, but there's also kind of an administrative process at the UN level. So firstly, you have to get the endorsement of the countries within your UN regional grouping, because they might want to host the COP as well. So altogether, those countries have to agree that, yes, Australia, you are best placed to host this event. And really importantly, if Australia's said it's going to be hosting it with Pacific countries, it has to get the Pacific region on board too.
That could be the key sticking point.
Yeah, well, I think both could be the key sticking point, because I think maybe the international community, in terms of those UN groupings, aren't necessarily aware of the difference between Australia's rhetoric, we talk big on climate internationally, and the reality of our planned fossil fuel expansion. So there's kind of two hurdles to get over there before we even get to, well, how would it work in practice? Where would it be hosted? Who would be the president? All that logistical stuff.
How did the leaders receive Australia's pledge to co-host COP with them? Did one nation express more interest than another, and did it come with conditions attached?
Well, they all expressed support for the bid, and you'll see that reflected in the communique. And every nation expressed support. They were very enthusiastic about the idea, because what it will do is to provide a focus on the very real threat that climate change has to our Pacific Island neighbours.
It sounds like this could be a good or a bad thing, depending on what the government does. What are the nuances here that we need to get into?
Yeah, so you're right. It could be a good or a bad thing. The COP itself is just an event. What comes out of it every year is important. So ideally, it's meant to be progressing these sort of internationally binding agreements between countries to stay as close to 1.5 degrees of global warming as possible. We're obviously seeing that that's not necessarily happening. Well, it's not happening at all. Why am I qualifying that? Where 2023 has seen the highest level of global emissions. So there's some question about how effective the COP process is. But going back to, the expo, the COP has kind of turned into a bit of an Olympics, where it's an event that countries use it for public branding and nation building.
And a bit of prestige.
A bit of prestige, yeah. It's sort of a prestigious kind of distinguished event. It's a bit of an honour to host it. But like the Olympics, it's a chance for countries to perhaps overstate what they're doing across any area, really. So Australia hosting the COP is the potential for, the government has said hosting a COP will repair Australia's reputation. So to me, that says they're kind of thinking about the optics about it before they actually talk about whether they're qualified to or not. And one of the ideas behind the UN Climate Conference, according to the UN, is that if you're hosting this event, you are tasked with raising climate ambition globally. And if you're a country that has over 100 new fossil fuel projects in development...
We're not super invested in lifting people's ambitions on
climate
change.
I would say actually it's not in our interests at all. I mean, our own climate target, just to remember the Paris Agreement, which is what is being negotiated at current COPs, it's about holding that 1.5 degree goal within our sights. Australia's domestic climate target overshoots, like it's not aligned with the 1.5 degree target. So does that make us qualified to be...
Yeah, right out of the gate.
Right out of the gate, does that make us qualified? But more than that, And interestingly, the COP has been called by people who support it in Australia, who really want this to happen because of sort of the opportunities it will provide them and others. It's been called Australia's Olympic moment on climate. And I think it's really important to remember how the Olympics has been gamed by governments, so excuse the pun, in the past to sports wash their reputations. And if you look back, I'm not sure if this has occurred to the people who are kind of championing this idea, but if you look back at Australia's history over decades, we have just manipulated and obstructed global climate negotiations for decades, like literally decades. We've fought to protect our resources industry.
Way back to the Kyoto Protocol,
Way back
if
to
I'm
the Kyoto
remembering
Protocol.
my history
So
correctly.
we signed pledges that we have no intention of keeping. We create loopholes with accounting, new clauses, especially for countries like Australia, so we can actually increase our emissions. And it's all been done so we can keep producing and exporting fossil fuels. And nothing's changed in terms of the fossil fuels in 2023.
Yeah, we've got a lot more investment in renewables and other good solutions coming down the pipeline, but so far still not tackling the actual problem.
Well, that all sounds great, but that's all in addition to the fossil fuels. So yeah, we'll be doing green hydrogen, renewables, critical minerals, but it's still like pedal to the metal when it comes to fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And the other thing to note is that Australia spends a significant amount of its foreign policy energy trying to secure buyers for its fossil fuels. So if Australia is hosting a COP in good faith and raising global climate ambition, we're talking our biggest buyers out of buying our gas and coal. Imagine if we raised the ambition of Korea or Japan. The Prime Minister was recently in India trying to sell our fossil fuels. So do we really want to kind of undermine the markets that we have for those products? If anything, I think the risk is that Australia uses something like hosting the COP to subvert climate ambition to try to make sure it's still got long-term buyers for our gas and coal.
Current policies are taking the world to a 2.8 degree temperature rise by the end of the century. That spells catastrophe, yet the collective response remains pitiful.
The head of the United Nations and the world scientists could not be any clearer in their message to Australia. No new coal and gas.
The Albanese government says a blanket ban on new gas projects would be irresponsible.
And all governments must stop subsidising fossil fuels and instead transfer those subsidies to renewables.
At all levels, governments, communities, individuals have made climate change somebody else's problem.
And I mean, it wouldn't have to be that way. If I think about Paris and the level of ambition that the French government put into making that a really kind of a landmark COP, and if I think about Glasgow and how much the UK government put into things like, that was where we saw some of the pledges around methane and coal, for example, which I don't think Australia signed up to either of those, but governments could use it to propel ambition.
Yeah, exactly, which is the idea, and I think that's the idea that sort of people who are supporting the idea of Australia hosting the COP are hoping for, that this will be enough to kind of drive more ambition from Australia. Like the hosting the COP is going to invite so much international scrutiny from both Pacific region and internationally that it will essentially be either inspired or shamed into taking climate action. I don't see hosting the COP as a good or a bad thing. I think if we do host the COP, then it kind of exposes us on the world stage, and that's a really good thing. If we're not ultimately awarded the COP, I think that sends a pretty clear signal to Australia that its current approach isn't working. I suppose I caution, like the Olympics, Russia was awarded the 2014 Olympics because it was promoting its environmental credentials and its stable political environment, and it was subsequently awarded the Olympics. And then we just saw in the 7 years leading up to the Games, like just sort of this litany of environmental and human rights transgressions. Beijing was awarded the Olympics in 2022 on the premise that it would improve human rights conditions. It was awarded them even though it hadn't improved human rights in exchange for the 2008
By the time
Olympics.
the Olympics rolled around.
But 2008 it was awarded the Olympics on the basis that it would do something about human rights. It didn't do that. And yet again in 2022, the international community, the Olympic Committee, said, well, we'll give you another chance, and nothing ever happened. So I suppose I'm sceptical that this will be an opportunity for Australia to change its ways. It would be wonderful if it was, but I think it's really important to remember how many years Australia has kind of been clinging grimly to fossil fuels in the face of the economic argument, completely against the scientific argument, community sentiment. All those things are outweighed by donations and lobbying and personal relationships. To me, I really wonder if a conference is going to be the thing that tips the scales for the Australian government.
Yeah.
Today's report from the IPCC is a sobering reminder of the urgency of addressing climate change.
It tells us that climate change is a real threat to human and planetary well-being.
The IPCC was so clear. No new coal and gas.
Because this is an ambitious plan, Mr. Speaker, and when you're engaging in an ambitious plan, you need to give industry the flexibility to implement that plan.
The safeguard mechanism is a pay-to-pollute model. Indeed, it seems to do more to safeguard the fossil fuel industry than it does to safeguard the future of our planet.
In fact, Australia and other developed nations must phase out coal by 2030.
So if I go back to what the Australian government would need to do, or let's go even more specific, the Pacific, if we want to host this in partnership with the Pacific, obviously they're on the extreme front lines of climate change impacts. They're directly affected. It's happening right now. It's an existential problem for Pacific nations. What do they want Australia to do?
So in general, they want Australia to stop producing and exporting fossil fuels. That's been a pretty clear ask since about 2015 is when they started getting really vocal about it. In terms of hosting a COP, as Seve Panyu said, we will only partner in this event with you if you phase out fossil fuels. Basically, you stop investing in them and you stop issuing new licenses. And when I say investing, I suppose I'm talking about subsidies. And if you give us adequate climate finance to deal with the increasing disasters that the climate change you are causing is hitting us with. And we need to be able to transition our economies too, and we need help doing that.
So, Polly, what's the take-home message for people who are grappling with this issue and whether or not it would be a good idea for Australia to host a COP?
I think just come at it with your eyes open. There's this fable about the scorpion and the frog. I don't know if you've heard it.
I have.
You have? So there's a frog crossing a river and a scorpion says, hey, mate, can you give me a ride? And the frog says, yeah, no, because you'll sting me. And the scorpion goes, no, I seriously won't sting you.
I promise.
I promise, I won't. And the frog lets the scorpion hop on, and then halfway across the river, the scorpion stings the frog. And as they're both sinking, the frog goes, well, why did you do that? Because now we're both going to die. And the scorpion goes, dude, I'm a scorpion.
It's my nature.
What did you think I was going to do? It's my nature. And I think that fable, that allegory is relevant politically for Australia because Australia has used so many official meetings, negotiations, whether it's UN or other kind of multilateral or bilateral forums to greenwash its fossil fuel expansion. And it's really nice to think that hosting a big expo is going to be the thing that gets us to change our ways, but I'm just not sure that it's compelling enough for that to happen. And the fact that the government has said, co-hosting this event will be a chance to repair our reputation, to me says they're already thinking about the optics, not actually what needs to be done. So in terms of what the takeaway is, I suppose just coming at this with your eyes open, it's really nice to think that it might inspire change.
But it'd be nice to see a bit of that change up front.
It'd be much nicer to see that change up front. Why hasn't it happened already? If Australia's now had a year to say we're back on the international stage, and we've just had 4 new coal mines approved after the safeguard mechanism was passed. We had forecasts come out from the government saying our coal is going to be increasing, coal exports will be increasing to 2028. Now is the chance, surely, that we should be seeing some of that action, not in 2026.
Yeah. So, Polly, you recently put out a research report about COP31 that goes into some of the details about this. What's the take-home message there for people?
I think it's just really laying everything out and asking the question about whether Australia is actually qualified to host the COP, if it will inspire that change that we know needs to happen, and if not, why not? You know, what Australia's track record has been in the past. And also, if people are interested, just some of the, you know, the logistical considerations for Australia in the international community, including, you know, the fact that hosting an event like the COP has an enormous carbon footprint. Are we prepared to own that? And some of those kind of diplomatic negotiations that need to occur to secure our bid.
Thank you very much, Polly.
Thanks, Em.
It may sound frightening, but the scientific evidence is that if we have not taken dramatic action within the next decade, we could face irreversible damage to the natural world and the collapse of our societies.
This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 14th of June 2023, and things may have changed since recording. If you liked today's episode, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And if you love the show and want to help us continue to do work with impact and influence, please consider supporting us with a small tax-deductible gift today at australiainstitute.org.au. That's also where you can find all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _NTT. Polly is at Polly J. Hemming, and our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.